Why isn't Donald Trump coming tomorrow? Because he has a 4-year-old mentality and he's having a tantrum that the rest of the world says, we don't want a king.
The Trump administration is boycotting the meeting over unsubstantiated claims of persecution of white South Africans.
Tonight's political story is bigger than a diplomatic snub, bigger than partisan rivalry, and bigger than the usual arguments about Donald Trump. What happened at the 2025 G20 Summit in Johannesburg, South Africa, is a moment historians will dissect for decades, because a single boycott didn't just create controversy. It shifted global power dynamics in real time. Donald Trump refused to attend the first-ever African-hosted G20, a moment designed to highlight global unity, economic cooperation, and new emerging leadership. Instead of showing up, he walked away, and by doing so, he left behind an empty chair that instantly became the most photographed symbol of the summit. According to coverage from the event, Trump's boycott was driven by unsubstantiated claims about alleged persecution of white South Africans, a narrative widely dismissed by governments and international observers. But here's where everything flips. The world didn't collapse in confusion. It didn't fracture without U.S. leadership. In fact, it did the opposite, and that is the stunning part. Nations moved closer together. Negotiations intensified. And into the void left by Washington, another political figure quietly stepped forward. This wasn't just global politics. It was global recalibration, and Canada was at the center of it. Welcome to Red Leaf Politics, where we break down the stories shaping Canada's political landscape, without the noise, without the spin, and without the assumptions that Canadian audiences don't deserve depth. Here we take complex global events and connect them directly to Canadian realities, Canadian interests, and Canadian leadership. Because in today's world, what happens at a G20 summit in Johannesburg or a trade meeting in Brussels can impact workers in Hamilton, students in Vancouver, and families in Halifax. Our approach is simple: clear analysis, balanced perspective, and respect for the intelligence of the audience. Canadian politics isn't just about question period clips or partisan drama. It's about understanding how international decisions ripple back home, especially when Canada suddenly finds itself stepping into roles usually reserved for the United States. And that's exactly why today's story matters. The world didn't just watch Trump boycott the G20, the world watched who filled the vacuum. Canada's presence, and specifically Mark Carney's, wasn't just symbolic, it was strategic. So if you want political coverage that respects nuance and goes deeper than headlines, you're in the right place. Let's get into today's major development. The breaking story is straightforward but politically explosive. Donald Trump boycotted the 2025 G20 Summit in South Africa, making the United States the only major economic power absent from the table. This G20 was historic, the first ever hosted on the African continent. Leaders expected tough negotiations on global conflicts, economic stability, climate commitments, and humanitarian aid. Instead, the spotlight shifted to the empty seat, where the U.S. president was supposed to sit. Trump's boycott revolved around a claim that white South Africans faced targeted killings and land seizures, a narrative discredited repeatedly by international bodies, journalists, and the South African government. His absence wasn't quiet, it was dramatic. American officials publicly refused to participate, framing it as a moral stand, but the rest of the world saw it differently. Inside Johannesburg's Summit Hall, the missing U.S. delegation created immediate uncertainty. For decades, Washington has been the gravitational center of the G20. Their absence introduced unpredictability. Would negotiations stall? Would alliances fracture? Would rival powers rush to fill the gap? But instead of chaos, something unexpected happened. Leadership emerged from unexpected places, including Canada. And this is where today's story takes a surprising turn. The Canadian government addressed Trump's boycott with deliberate restraint. Official statements avoided direct confrontation, focusing instead on reaffirming Canada's commitment to multilateral cooperation. Ottawa emphasized that the G20 is most effective when major powers show up, physically and diplomatically, but carefully avoided criticizing the United States by name. Mark Carney, attending as part of Canada's delegation, echoed the same tone inside the summit. His message was calm, measured, and focused on continuity. Carney emphasized that the world's challenges, conflict zones, debt crises, climate instability, and humanitarian emergencies don't wait for domestic political disputes. Without referencing Trump directly, Carney subtly conveyed that global leadership is defined by presence, not absence. Prime Minister Mark Carney, if he is PM in your narrative, or the Canadian government, if Carney is attending in another role, highlighted Canada's role as a bridge builder. Ministers repeatedly stated that Canada would help maintain momentum on key agreements, ensuring progress despite the missing American delegation. Diplomatically, Canada positioned itself as a stabilizer rather than a critic. The message was simple: the world keeps moving, and Canada intends to move with it, collaboratively, constructively, and confidently. Politically, the government's tone signaled something deeper: a belief that leadership is demonstrated, not declared. Back home, opposition parties reacted sharply, but not all in the same direction. Conservative critics argued that Canada shouldn't capitalize on America's absence and warned that taking a more prominent global role could damage long-term U.S.-Canada relations if Trump wins re-election. They accused the government of trying to score diplomatic points while Washington is in crisis. Some even suggested that Trump's boycott reflected legitimate concerns, repeating parts of the disputed narrative. The New Democratic Party took a different angle, criticizing the Liberals for tiptoeing around Trump and failing to call out misinformation. They argued that Canada should defend international cooperation more forcefully and challenge disinformation, especially when it risks destabilizing global forums like the G20. The Bloc Québécois focused on sovereignty and economic implications, questioning whether Canada could meaningfully influence outcomes without U.S. partnership. Meanwhile, Greens emphasized the climate dimension, suggesting that America's absence created a rare opportunity for stronger global commitments. What united all opposition voices was the recognition that something historic happened. Whether they framed it as an opportunity, a danger, or a diplomatic minefield, all sides agreed. Canada suddenly occupied more space on the world stage, and that shift carries political risk at home. Why does a G20 boycott thousands of kilometers away matter to Canadians? Because decisions made at those tables influence almost every aspect of daily life, from prices at the grocery store to interest rates, immigration policy, trade access, and even the security of Canada's borders. First, economic stability. When the U.S. skips the G20, global markets react. Investors worry about policy uncertainty. That affects inflation, borrowing costs, and the value of the Canadian dollar. A chaotic summit would have hit Canadian households quickly. Second, trade. Canada relies heavily on international agreements to protect industries like energy, autos, agriculture, and tech. The G20 shapes those frameworks. If America deliberately disengages, Canada must secure partnerships elsewhere, potentially reshaping the future of Canadian exports. Third, global crises. From Gaza to Ukraine to climate disasters, G20 decisions shape humanitarian aid and refugee pathways. That affects Canada's immigration system, communities, and long-term planning. Finally, leadership perception. When Canadian officials step up internationally, it strengthens our voice in negotiations that directly affect Canadian consumers and workers. Whether viewers support or oppose the current government, the reality is simple. Empty American chairs create openings, and whoever fills them influences policies that reach Canadian wallets and futures. Canadian foreign policy analysts observing the summit offer a clear interpretation. Trump's boycott wasn't just a diplomatic misstep. It accelerated a geopolitical transition that was already underway. Experts note that the U.S. has been retreating from multilateral institutions for years, from the Paris Agreement to the World Health Organization. This absence, they argue, signals to allies and rivals alike that American reliability is increasingly conditional. Several analysts point out that Canada, traditionally overshadowed by its southern neighbor at global events, had a rare chance to demonstrate leadership. Carney's quiet but steady influence inside the summit hall, maintaining focus, guiding discussions, and reassuring hesitant leaders, became a case study in effective diplomacy under pressure. Policy scholars add that Trump's decision sent conflicting signals internationally. One superpower walked out over a debunked narrative, while mid-sized democracies like Canada remained committed to cooperation. This contrast, they argue, shapes global perceptions of credibility. Economists also highlight that when the U.S. steps back, coalitions often reorganize, and Canada can either adapt or be sidelined. Analysts warn that ignoring these shifts would be a strategic mistake. The overarching expert view: leadership vacuums never remain empty for long. Someone always steps in. To fully understand the magnitude of Trump's boycott, we have to rewind. For decades, the United States was the anchor of the G20, the country whose presence stabilized markets, guided negotiations, and set the tone for global cooperation. Even when leaders clashed, they assumed Washington would show up. But Trump's political worldview has always been skeptical of multilateralism. His first presidency saw withdrawals from global agreements, accusations of globalist agendas, and frequent clashes with institutions like NATO and the WTO. Many diplomats believe the 2025 boycott wasn't spontaneous, it was ideological. Behind the scenes, international officials were already bracing for turbulence. Weeks before the summit, rumors circulated that Trump's team was considering skipping Johannesburg altogether. Diplomats prepared contingency plans, drafting alternative negotiation frameworks in case the U.S. walked out. Another hidden factor: many nations arrived expecting geopolitical friction, especially with Russia and China present. The U.S. absence meant tense topics: Ukraine, Middle East tensions, climate finance, unfolded without the usual American pushback or mediation. And in that vacuum, smaller coalitions gained influence. Canada, the EU, South Africa, and Australia suddenly had more room to shape outcomes. The show didn't stop when Trump stepped away, it simply changed casts. So where does this leave Canada and the world after the most controversial G20 in years? First, expect diplomatic recalibration. Allies will reassess how much they can depend on Washington if Trump continues prioritizing symbolic boycotts over strategic engagement. Even countries aligned with U.S. interests will quietly diversify partnerships. Second, Canada is likely to be approached more frequently as a mediator. When the U.S. is unpredictable, nations look for stable democracies with economic credibility. Analysts predict more requests for Canada to co-chair working groups, draft proposals, and manage delicate negotiations. Third, Trump's decision will carry domestic consequences. If he remains in the White House, foreign leaders may question the long-term reliability of U.S. participation in global governance. For Canada, this unpredictability presents both opportunity and risk. Stepping into leadership roles can elevate our influence, but also exposes us to new political pressure. Finally, future G20 summits may adjust structurally. If America continues disengaging, the organization might shift toward a more decentralized leadership model, amplifying voices like Canada, India, the EU, and South Africa. The world will keep moving, and the question is whether the U.S. intends to move with it. At the end of the day, Trump's boycott of the 2025 G20 wasn't just a diplomatic snub. It was a turning point, one that revealed how the world behaves when a superpower steps back, and how countries like Canada respond when global leadership becomes a shared responsibility instead of an American expectation. Inside Johannesburg, the empty American seat wasn't just a symbol of absence, it became a statement, a reminder that global cooperation doesn't depend on one man, one presidency, or one country. It depends on nations willing to engage, negotiate, and show up, even when the politics are messy and the challenges are enormous. Canada did that, and whether you support the current government or not, the reality is clear. The world paid attention. Thank you for watching Red Leaf Politics, where we break down the stories that matter, not just for headlines, but for the future of this country. If you want more balanced, deeply researched Canadian political analysis, consider subscribing. It helps us bring you the kind of journalism that respects your intelligence and your time. Now I want to hear from you. Was Trump's boycott a strategic decision or a diplomatic disaster? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We read every one.